Hello, I'm Scott Thompson, and welcome to After 10. It's been 6 years now since a jury trial system was first introduced in Korea, and a fair amount of growing pains have been felt over that period of time. On today's After 10, we take a closer look at the jury trial system here in Korea and at ways to improve it.
It's been 6 years since the jury trial system was introduced in Korea, but the challenges in implementing it continue. To increase transparency in the judicial decision-making process, the jury trial system was implemented in 2008. There have been rising concerns that people might come into the trial with prejudice and that they may succumb to emotion and be unbiased. On today's After 10, we discuss ways to better implement the jury trial system in Korea.
Professor Song, thank you very much for being on the program.
Good to be here.
Let's start, if we will, with a brief introduction to the jury trial system and how it works here in Korea.
Right. The stated purpose of this is to increase the legitimacy of the trial system in Korea, and also increase the transparency. History-wise, Korea has been under authoritarian rules, and before that it was a colonial rule. So there is a kind of felt need that the citizens or the people need to be more involved in this, so that the trials and also the judiciary in general needs to be viewed in a more enlightened and transparent manner.
And of course, there are many other countries throughout the world that use a jury trial system. It might be helpful if we could compare and contrast a little bit the Korean system to some of the other systems we see throughout the rest of the world.
Kind of a cook's tour of this kind of system is that there is, on one part, Anglo-American common law jury system. And then there is a civil law system which uses a lot of mixed tribunal, or where laymen are included in a trial, sitting along with the judge. A Korean system is kind of a hybrid system where it is a jury system, but has more of a responsibility than the common law jury. Common law juries usually engage only in fact-finding mission. But in Korea, they are also involved in sentencing. So in an experimental stage, they are mix and matching these two elements to that. The kind of upshot in this is that most of the advanced countries uses some form of a participation system. Either it is a mixed tribunal or the common law jury system or the variations thereof. Most of the authoritarian regimes don't. So Korea probably felt the need to move into more of in a club where more participation is guaranteed for the people.
Is there a particular reason, though, why this particular model, this hybrid model, as you described it, why that was chosen over other models out there?
I think the intent is that they wanted to look at different aspects, different parts that constitute this participation. So that's why they brought in some elements from the common law jury system and also some from the mixed tribunals. So, and they stated that we're going to run it in an experimental form for 4 or 5 years. Now it's been 6th year, so it's been delayed a little bit. But that just indicates that there are more to look at and more to assess to see whether we can continue with this hybrid model or pick and choose in different forms.
And in terms of the scope of the trials that a Korean jury might participate in, what sorts of trials are they taking part in right now?
They started with serious crimes involving killings, death, and bribery and others. So the scope of it had to be limited so that it is confined to crimes that are serious enough that it'll generate a lot of interest.
But not everybody gets a jury trial, though, correct?
No, it's given a choice so that those defendants can make their choice as to whether they will get the jury trial or not. And there's a variation actually in this. In the US, they use what is called the opt-out system. If nothing is done, they get the jury trial, but they can opt out or with the agreement with the state or other parties. But in Korea, it's opt-in system where they have to actually make an application to get the jury trial. So it's a little bit harder to get the jury trial. If they are dilly-dally about the schedules, they miss the chance.
There is a bit of uneasiness still about the system. You mentioned the word experimental. This is a relatively new system for Korea. It's just been 6 years now, right, since the system was introduced. Some of the concerns about the system, could you elaborate on those for us?
I think the biggest one, at least I think, is the low recognition. I think that people still don't know much about the jury trial and what it can bring to us. The other one is, I think that as the recent cases show, there might be some Korea-specific concerns, like the regional discrepancy, regional disparities in the political ideologies and the feelings and sentiment about particular cases. So people kind of point to that to say that in Korea, along with a low recognition, there might be some cases where regional biases or the kind of biases that the different segments of people have might influence too much on the outcome. I think that the issue has not been fully resolved.
You'll see this in every country, though, right? I mean, that's always a concern with any jury trial system, no matter the country, right? The bias there.
Right, it is. I mean, I think a lot of people know about the Rodney King trial in the U.S., where the trial was held in a place called the Simi Valley, which was pretty much all white neighborhood, and in fact the jury members were all white except for two, and that they had a verdict that goes overwhelmingly advantageous to the white police officers, and they gave rise to a riot. So people point to that and say, well, you know, if you don't run it right, that's the kind of outcome that might have. I think that Korea is exactly doing that. In an experimental stage, they are considering whether the political question is the right question for the jury trial or not. People have different opinions. I think that they'll try to see what would work in this country in a Korean style.
You say that some people may not be fully aware of the merits of a jury trial system, especially here in Korea. Make the case for us. What are some of the merits for the jury trial system here?
Well, I can make several kind of aspects of it. One is we got our jury system, not the jury system, but the legal system itself from Japan during the colonial rule. So I think there is still a vestige of authoritarian kind of aspect to it. That contributes to a lack of transparency and a lack of participation. I think that that's the biggest point that this experiment or this reform is trying to address. And that is a big thing. And the other is that the Korean jury system will introduce people the trial processes and what type of legal procedure is involved in it. And that adds to the legitimacy and the transparency of the trial process itself. So I think that those kind of things can contribute to the dispute resolution in general so that the society is more harmonious, and also people would have various venues that they can go to without introducing too much uncertainty in those choices.
We are just about 6 years in through this process now. You mentioned that there have been some growing pains over that period of time. Since its implementation, the jury trial system, how has it progressed and how has the perception of the system changed here in Korea?
I think that the kinds of problems that this experiment had goes to kind of questions that you have. One is, because of the scope of a jury trial is limited, there has not been many cases. So the sample size is kind of small. So awareness problem is contributed from that aspect. And the other is because of that small sample size, there has been some couple of cases involving political issues that has come to the public awareness with a lot of force. I think the An Do-hyun case this year actually, is kind of an exemplary case where people would point to that as a kind of politically biased decision. And I'm not sure whether there is too much bias involved in it, but people automatically assume that there has been a bias.
But the same holds true, though, for any trial, right? The question being, a jury, let's say, gives a guilty verdict, for instance, and the judge can simply overturn it. That's causing some people to question whether or not the system is actually working. Is that a valid concern there?
I don't think it's a valid concern because, first of all, the sample size is so small. But then even in the U.S. or England, there has always been a device for the judge to not really heed the verdict of the jury. In the United States, what's called the JNOV, judgment notwithstanding verdict, is something the judge can use to look at the verdict and say, well, if it does not make sense, then he can make the judgment without heeding the verdict.
And a big part of this also comes down to the jurors themselves, the people who are selected here. How is that selection process? How does it work? And how might it be different from other countries that are using the system?
The way I look at it is very similar to the U.S. system, where in Korea, anybody who are over 20 years old, they can be randomly selected, and then they get summoned to the court, and the ultimate selection is by the method of questioning. In the U.S., they call it the voir dire, which is designed to elicit some information about the potential juror, whether they are capable of it, whether they have certain biases, or whether their predisposition because of their upbringing or what they do would be predisposed in one way or the other on the case. And that can be determined by both parties involved in that the procedure, so that they can determine whether some jurors are fit for it or some jurors are not.
Generally speaking, this idea of a jury system, how have the people responded to it over the past 6 years?
Well, that's one of the problems. People didn't really respond it well. The participation rate was pretty low. But I think it's improving, and one of the things that we have to do is to let people know that this system, although it has been an experimental stage, it has been gaining some traction. So if it gets fully implemented, I think there has to be some public campaigns to let people know that this is a serious matter, this is one of the civic duties that we are privileged to have, as with other countries. So we got to take it really seriously. I think that kind of a public campaign needs to go together with the full implementation.
And a question has to be asked then, why is the jury system the right system here in Korea?
I think that the people's participation has been in the offing. I think that the political democratization has progressed in a way that people are more involved in the political processes and also making decisions. I think that the corporate side as well, they're making headway. The judicial side, for a long time, the judiciary has been not very independent from the president and the Blue House for a long time. But it has changed, of course. So this is the right time to make this kind of reform to be in line with the other advanced countries, but more importantly, they will be more fully empowered and also feel more responsible for the outcome of what happened in the judiciary.
And in terms of doing that, making the reforms, making the system better, we've brushed upon the shortcomings of the system. We've glossed over them a little bit here, but in looking at the system as it is right now, what problems do you see, and how exactly do you correct the problems as you see them?
Well, there are several kind of generic problems that the jury trials have, especially the common law jury system. Complex cases, lay juries have a pretty much a hard time dealing with it. Second, the biases that the jury members might hold, especially these days when the social media and the advent of the internet spreads false rumors or the impressions so very quickly, that can influence people's opinions one way or the other very quickly. So I think that's shortcomings that jury system might have. And also, I think the participation. The Korea has become a very busy society, and people are not really predisposed to sit on the jury, especially it runs over several days or even several weeks. So those kind of shortcomings, those kind of limitations needs to be addressed.
There can perhaps, I think as you mentioned earlier, be lessons to be learned from other countries who have implemented jury trial systems in the early stages. What, I suppose, growing pains or challenges did other countries face in implementing this system that Korea can learn from?
I think that in the U.S., their kind of promotion system is pretty impressive. I think that they impress upon people that this is a very important civic duty that they have to undertake. And actually, the penalty is pretty severe on paper. They don't usually kind of enforce it, but if you get the paper, it has some scary languages to it. But not only scary, but if you read it, you kind of have an impression that this is an awesome responsibility that people take on. So that's a kind of a public promotion side. But the other is, I think that they are tweaking many different ways. If it's a complex trial, then they don't really give it to the lay juries. They're making, especially in the U.S., in several states, they're making specialty courts. Things like, patent trials, and also bankruptcy trials, or in some states, family courts, when the emotions or the complexity of the issues may make it a little bit harder for the lay members. They're making a kind of expert opinions more weigh in to that process. So they're trying to make it easier for the lay members.
And there are discussions that next year there will be reforms to the system here. What can we expect down the line as far as changes go?
I think the biggest change would be, so far, the verdict has been advisory only. It was a kind of a recommendation. It's not binding, but it's going to be more binding. I don't think that the language is the judge has to follow, but I think that there will be a strong language included in that reform, new revision to the law to say that the judge is more encouraged to follow it. And also, I think that there might be some changes in the composition of the jury members. So far, Korean juries use 7-member or 9-member jury, and it could go down to 5 members, especially those cases where facts are not really disputed. In the U.S., 12 members is usually the case, a lot of 9-member juries. But 7 to 9-member juries, it's not really large enough so that we can use the group intelligence. And
what does that mean exactly?
Well, I think that you have to have a sufficient number of members to pour their various backgrounds and different opinions and come to kind of group decision. But if it's only 5 or 7, I think the strong personalities could dominate that jury deliberation room. That has been a problem in some states in the U.S. I think that that is a problem in Korea. So I think that composition might have to be changed a little bit. Probably another issue that might have is to kind of educate it to educate the potential jury members better so that they will have an easier time to do it. A lot of people kind of point to another aspect of Korean jury system that is problematic, which is to let them participate in the sentencing process, which U.S. court does not. I don't think it's too much of a problem, but in order to have the lay members participate in the sentencing, I think that there has to be a better educational system than they have now.
Looking ahead to the next 6 years, we're 6 years in now. Is the future of the jury trial system bright here in Korea? How do you expect the perceptions to change over that time?
That's a little bit tricky question. Let me explain why. I think that the jury system or some form of jury participation or the citizens' participation are bright, and in a normative sense, it has to happen. But at the same time, in a global level, the participation system is a little bit on the decline, not because the democratic spirit is in the decline, but because of other advent of the mechanisms of other nature. For example, in Korea, one of the things that we do not have is a plea bargaining device. But in the US, they use a lot of plea bargaining to reduce the complexity and the docket load. But that contribute to the decrease of a lot of jury trials. And the advent of other dispute resolution systems like the arbitration and others in the business cases, that reduces the number of jury trials. So in a sense, it is a good the advancement in that sense. In Korea, probably before we worry about that, probably we should kind of get up the level of the participation from people, awareness of the people, and the kind of a sense of civic duty of the people, so that this has to kind of settle in as a culture that people are involved and participating in this aspect of the civic life. So in a sense, Korea has to move forward, but the rest of the world is finding other ways to do it. So I think that we'll strike a balance at some point.
These things take time.
And these things take time. And the jury trials, in any kind of trial, the two drawbacks are it takes too much time and also it's too expensive. So that's why other countries or the judicial system is looking for innovation. But in Korea, innovation has to go with some advancement in this area.
The growing pains of the jury trial system in Korea. Professor Song, thank you very much for being on the program and shedding some light on this very complex issue today. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time after 10.